Hello and welcome back to Live from Our Living Room. I'm Ethan Plotkin. Joining me today is Meghan O'Sullivan, who has too many titles to list, but for the purposes of our conversation is a former Deputy National Security Advisor and the current director of Harvard Kennedy School's Geopolitics of Energy Initiative. Professor O'Sullivan, welcome.
Thank you, Ethan. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Well, we have to start in Europe. Undoubtedly the most important global political story of the year has been Russia's menacing around and now partial invasion of Ukraine. And over the past few months, as Russia began deploying forces, NATO members have shown incredible unity and resolve. They stood up for the principle of national sovereignty. They've sent military equipment to Ukraine in a stunning defiance of this Russian belligerence, with one notable exception. So what's the story? Why has Germany, until recently, been more hesitant to rally to Ukraine's defense?
Well, I think the reason why Germany has been a little bit of an outlier, and you do point out that has changed in the last day or two, but the reason why it's been harder, or why it was harder to get Germany to the same place as others, is just because Germany and Russia have a relationship that is much deeper than a lot of the other countries. And Germany has traditionally regarded Russia as a country that was a difficult country, but one that Germany was able to work with, while at the same time Germany could be at the center of Europe, have a special relationship with the Americans, and also a special relationship with kind of the Central and East Europeans. And I think if you just focus on the economics of it, Germany's economic ties with Russia are massive. We've heard a lot about the energy ties, and there I think it's important to point out that while Europe as a whole is dependent on Russia for about 40% of its natural gas. For Germany, that's more like half. So Germany is more dependent on Russian natural gas than the average in Europe. And whereas many other countries have some adequate liquefied natural gas facilities to bring in gas from other locations, Germany hasn't really made the same investments in those facilities because it really has believed that Russia is a reliable supplier. And it has been for Germany.
One of the most important responses, I think, to this Russian aggression has been, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced yesterday that he was planning to suspend the certification of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And this has been a point of tension between Germany and its Western allies. Can you tell us just a little bit about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline?
Sure. So the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is basically an $11 billion major infrastructure project that's been underway. I think it was first announced in 2018 and recently completed at the end of last year. And it is to take Russian gas to Germany and the rest of Europe through a route through the Baltic Sea that basically the strategic objective from the part of the Russians is to avoid taking all of Russia's natural gas through Ukraine to Europe. So the Russians invested in a series of pipelines, Nord Stream 2 being one of them, that would essentially allow Russia to continue its trade, natural gas trade with Western Europe without having to run all of it through Ukraine. I mean, literally as of 2009, you had 80% of the gas that Europe consumed from Russia go through Ukraine. And one thing that I don't think I've yet made clear, Ethan, is that this pipeline is ready to go, but as you suggested, it still required one last thing, the certification by the Germans, and that would basically allow the gas to flow. So the fact that Chancellor Olaf Scholz came out and said that it's not going ahead with the certification doesn't mean that like natural gas is suddenly stopping flowing to Europe, because that gas and Nord Stream 2 has not yet made it to Europe, but it does send an incredibly strong signal. Olaf Scholz just recently has demonstrated that, yes, Germany is standing with the rest of its transatlantic and European partners, and that this enormous investment is not going to bear fruit as long as we have this conflict with Russia.
To your point, you can't have a Nord Stream 2 without a Nord Stream 1. And Germany, like you mentioned, is already incredibly dependent on Russian natural gas, despite being so committed, more committed than almost any Western country to renewable energy sources like solar and wind. So how did they end up so dependent? What policy choices did the Germans make to end up so dependent on Russian gas?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think, again, I want to underscore one thing, which is that Europeans, from an American perspective, we've always kind of looked at this dependency on Russian gas and thought it was a huge strategic vulnerability. And, the 90s, if you were an American national security foreign policy person, of all of the American efforts to try to help build pipelines in the Caspian and elsewhere to try to get energy resources to Europe that don't go through Russia. Europeans, and not just the Germans, have had a different perspective and have seen the Russians as being reliable suppliers, even when they were the Soviet Union, and that throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union didn't disrupt this natural gas flow. So there was a much greater comfort with it. But as your question suggested, there have been a couple of decisions that have been made recently by Germany in the interest of this energy transition to a more sustainable energy future that has exacerbated this. And let's just say it's made Germany and less flexible in terms of being able to weather this storm. The most important one of these decisions is the decision made by former Chancellor Angela Merkel to phase out German nuclear energy. So Germany has been progressively phasing out the use of nuclear power in its country. And basically in 2022, this is the year where the last two nuclear power plants are supposed to be shut down in Germany. And because natural gas and nuclear power are good substitutes, this has basically kind of exacerbated German vulnerability. And there's also simultaneously been the desire on the part of Germany to phase out its coal use because of the high carbon content and the big emissions associated with coal. So you see Germany trying to get rid of the other two energy sources that have that are substitutable for natural gas. And that kind of helps explain why there isn't more flexibility in the German system right now.
You mentioned coal, and I want to get back to that very shortly, but there's a paradox here that I think is really fundamental that I would love for you to explain. You'd think that as developed economies start to taper their reliance on fossil fuels and natural gas and move to what we think of as standard renewable energy sources, petrostates like Russia and Saudi Arabia would become marginally weaker. So why isn't that happening right now?
Yeah, well, I think there's a big difference here between what's going to happen in the long run. So we talk about the world reaching net zero in the year 2050, and that is the very ambitious goal that by 2050, the world would be emitting a net zero carbon, have a net zero carbon footprint. And so the sense is that that's where everybody's heading. That will involve more renewable energy, less fossil fuels over time. Now, of course, this takes some time. This is something that actually is very, very hard to do. And one of the things that there's some element of this happening now, but I anticipate it's going to happen repeatedly over the course of these decades as we try to get to 2050, is that there'll be a gap in between the investment we need in energy and in the demand that we have for energy. And that tends to empower kind of traditional producers of fossil fuels. So today we're seeing it empowers Russia. Tomorrow it could be Saudi Arabia or other producers that actually see an opportunity, because when you have supply and demand out of whack, if it's in the direction that it is now, it means you're going to have a lot higher prices.
You mentioned Germany's coal exit. And I'm hoping we can use that as a case study to transition from the geopolitics of energy to the politics of energy. And the New Yorker published an article a few weeks ago about Germany's perilous effort to wean itself off coal. And there's a quote in the piece from a coal worker that I think is really instructive about the politics of the clean energy transition. I'd love to get your reaction. So he says, if other countries look to see how Germany has fared, and they see deindustrialization and a loss of prosperity and the people growing discontent and populism gaining a foothold, who would follow our example? Do you care to respond to that?
Sure. I would certainly say that this moment, for all the reasons we've talked about, is one where there is heightened sensitivity to the reality that the energy transition is going to be expensive. Those disruptions to those communities, or also just to the pocketbook of households, is actually suddenly recognized as being a threat to the ability to execute the energy transition. So there's this irony in the sense that these political fallouts from the energy transition could be the things that really prevent the energy transition from being successful. But I would say these issues have really come to the fore in the last few years. I'd say even 3 or 4 years ago, a just transition, if you said that phrase, it probably wouldn't mean a lot to a lot of people. They wouldn't really know what we're talking about. Now you say just transition and people think about a number of things that are seen as essential to getting right if the transition is going to be sustainable. And one of them is this relationship between communities within countries, but there's also a justice dimension to the relationship between some of the wealthier countries that are able to focus more on getting to a sustainable energy mix, and developing countries which really feel like they are suffering, and they are suffering the effects of climate change more than many developing countries, and they're doing it through no fault of their own. They were the least contributors to the carbon emissions that is creating the climate change, yet they're the ones that are going to have to bear the costs as much. So there's a sense that the energy transition, unless it's really coupled with thoughtful and deliberate intentional policy mechanisms, that it could really increase inequity on multiple dimensions.
So speaking of developing countries, you co-authored a wide-ranging piece in Foreign Affairs last month on this subject, the geopolitics of the energy transition. Among many things, one thing that really jumped out to me was this hopeful vision of the future where access to energy proliferates across the developing world, and with a few exceptions, namely the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there's less competition over finite resources. Perhaps that's a story of less interstate conflict and more democracy. That's a really exciting idea. So how can the US facilitate this future in the developing world?
So I think it's funny, in the article that I wrote with my friend and colleague, Jason Bordoff, we were talking about, there's good reasons to believe that if and when the world gets to net zero, which I hope will be by 2050, but that's a very ambitious goal, that the geopolitics of energy will look different, and that some of the more noxious elements of the geopolitics of oil and gas won't be so dominant in our politics. My particular focus, and the focus of that article, was a bit more on how to manage the geopolitics of it so the transition doesn't get derailed by the geopolitics. And the best example, I think, really in the article, and is getting more attention nowadays, is about critical minerals. So it is becoming more widely appreciated that so many renewable energy technologies, be it wind turbines or electric vehicles, whatever it is, need critical minerals, which are actually produced in very few countries around the world right now, and at levels that aren't nearly enough to meet the demand of the kind of transition we're expecting. So, the sense is that we're going to have a problem of production, that there won't be enough diversification of producers around the world. So the location for the production of many of these critical minerals is much more concentrated even than oil and gas. So if you think about Saudi Arabia and Russia and the US roughly all producing about 10% of the world's oil, the Congo produces more than 70% of the world's cobalt. So obviously this is an area, and especially if we got into how China plays into this, is an area that could be ripe for conflict, competition over these minerals, but also, trying to prevent different countries from having adequate access to it, stockpiles, embargoes. So it could slow down the energy transition. It could, it could make the world, move a lot more slowly than it needs to move if it's going to meet these goals in time to keep the climate from warming beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius.
There's a myth that I think you may have just successfully busted, which is that the US is now energy independent, which we know is just not the case. We're so reliant on raw materials from other countries, China most worryingly. So last question, second to last question, what do American policymakers need to do to shore up our critical mineral supply chain so that we are not at geopolitical risk and so that we have a successful political transition in the United States and that we bring everyone along for the ride?
Yeah, great multifaceted question. Let me first just say a word about energy independence, because I think it is often misunderstood. And the fact that the United States is much more energy independent than it was before is true. But what does that actually mean? I think many people think about energy independence as being one in which we meet all of our own energy needs. And so that basically, regardless of what's happening outside in the world with oil and gas, with Saudi Arabia or this or that, it doesn't really affect Americans. This couldn't be further from the truth. We're still very vulnerable to price shocks and disruptions in the global economy in a way that I think people don't often appreciate. In terms of the critical minerals, it's a really good question. And I would say that it is one that there's still a lot of work and policy thinking that needs to be done. I will be chairing a task force with, again, my co-author, Jason Mordoff, on this question. What kind of strategy does the US need? But there are a few things that I think are already clear. I mean, one is this question of, is the US prepared to actually mine inside its own borders to get some of these critical minerals? The reality is that it's environmentally really unattractive to mine these minerals, and that places like China have brought down the cost of refining them so low that it hasn't even been an economically attractive proposition for countries like the United States to mine and process these minerals. So one, the question is, does the US want to do more of that at home? Or two, can the US develop relationships with countries like Argentina or Chile or even Mexico in our own hemisphere, where we can have a relationship where maybe there's more mining done there and processing done in the US? There's also two other policy recommendations that clearly belong somewhere in the basket of a good strategy. One is stockpiling. You know, how much should we stockpile oil? And the question is, are there certain minerals that we should be stockpiling as well? And then the last thing, which is where I put a lot of my hope for the future, is actually being able to recycle these minerals so they're not finite resources, and being able to just substitute things for them. You know, my sense is that given the impetus and the national security imperative, that we can innovate our way to less dependency, although I don't expect that will happen quickly.
And are members of both parties taking this issue as seriously as it needs to be taken?
I think it's definitely risen on the agenda. I think it first got attention congressionally in 2010, where you may remember China actually did stop exporting rare earth elements to Japan when they were in a spat over the Senkaku Islands. And that seemed to be a pretty blatant, you know, even though there was some commercial reason given, it seemed to be a pretty political statement. You know, we're stopping exporting these rare earth minerals, which Japan has a hard time getting from anywhere else. And I think that really raised the antennae of American policymakers. And as we become more and more aggressive in our own energy transition, I think our vulnerability has captured the imagination of many. I think we're still not to a place where we have agreed upon strategy, but I'm confident we can get there.
Well, Professor O'Sullivan, I hope you have no plans to retire anytime before 2050, because we need you. And then Lord willing,
I hope I live to 2050.
I think we all do. So thank you so much. It was great to have this conversation. I hope it's people will start thinking about these issues more seriously.
Well, thank you, Ethan. It's really been a pleasure to speak with you, and I appreciate having the chance to be in your living room.
Likewise, yours seems much better decorated than mine.
Well, mine's virtual, so there.